So, welcome back. It's time to talk about Chapter 3, which is called Tending the Soul of the Institution, from the book How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And this starts taking us, we're still kind of in the setup part of the book, in the things to keep in mind as we start working on things through the next several chapters. And this chapter really says, okay, so how do we tend the soul of the institution? And it talks about all of the next chapters, kind of the discernment, the shaping of our memory, what are the stories we tell about who we are, and working towards clarifying our purpose and how we use that to help us stay in line with what it means to be true to the soul of Maplewood. And the reason that is there's the piece of knowing that when you're a church of any size, there are many choices of which programs to start, which would be the right direction to go, how to shape them, who's the right person to lead them. And it isn't the same regardless of where you are. In fact, what is the right program to start? What is the right approach to your neighborhood? What are the things you should prioritize is really determined by the soul of who the church is. And so one of the key pieces is starting to ask that question of what is the soul of Maplewood? Now, this chapter really does a lot of helping understand the pieces of what the soul isn't, so we don't get confused. The soul is not our vision. The soul is not our goal. Hopefully our goals are aligned with the soul of Maplewood. But the soul is that almost undefinable piece that really made Maplewood take off and speak to the people who came and were part of it, part of starting it, have been part of the journey as the church has flourished. And so some of the pieces getting to that piece of how do we start to understand what was really at the heart of what started Maplewood. Now, one of the things is this piece of authenticity, is that as a church, we don't have to be anybody else's church. We don't have to be like First. We don't have to be like St. Paul's. We don't have to be like St. Andrew's. We don't have to be like the church down the street or across the country. If we're going to flourish as a church and have a real life and vitality to us, the key is being authentic to who we are, not being what everybody else is. And one of the key pieces that this talks about is the quote on page 50 that kind of talks about that this piece, what is our role as the leader during this liminal time? It said, a leader working with the soul of the institution is looking for resonance between the proposed course of action and the true self of the organization. So it isn't just, do we need to offer a luncheon? It is that luncheon true to who we are? And how does it fit into us living out faithfully who God has called us to be? So in this chapter, that is talking about that piece of how do we understand the soul and how do we start thinking about the soul of the church. For me, that is one of the amazing things about reading history. And my history teachers in school would be completely surprised to know how much I have come to love reading the history of churches, to learn all of those stories and the things that were written down as the most important to remember in the first year, the things that were done and where you can see God in those. And it truly is that sense of when we can get back to that and understand how that translates to the time and place we are now living in, when we tap into that energy, that soul that started the church in the first place, we truly have a unique voice to speak into our neighborhood and the voice that God has given us to speak. Now, in addition to kind of talking about those pieces that define what is the soul and what isn't, one of the things it talks about is, here's the aspect about having a soul, is recognizing the church as a living organism. And that seems like a strange way to think about it, but I talked about this in some of those meetings in the first couple months, is talking about the life cycle of a church. And the life cycle of a church or an organization follows, I always think of that same bell curve that we remember from school, where the teachers graded on the curve so that some fell really high and some fell really low, but the majority were somewhere in the middle. When we're talking about the church, and this is on the handout that's attached, we're talking about a life cycle in that a church starts down here and moves up to here. The struggle with that life cycle is that no life cycle continues straight up forever. There is a point where we hit a peak and then things start to slow down. And for a church, it's thinking about those first part is about the shaping and the understanding of who we are and who God's calling us to be, and then starting to share that message and how that brings people in, and there's excitement and growth as we live into that. And then there is a time where it starts to be, it's assumed that everybody knows the story, everybody knows the plan, and you start to see decline. And less people coming, less new people joining, less energy around the ministries. And what they talk about with the life cycle is you have a choice. You either continue to follow that bell curve until the institution has died, or at some point on that headed down side of the bell curve, you come back and say, wait a minute, who are we? Who do we want to be? And how does that energize us again? And then you start a new life cycle. Now, I made that sound really easy, like you could answer a few questions and head in that direction, but it is a consciousness of the organization reclaiming its soul and then being authentic to that message and living it out. And you can, if you think about that bell curve, you can realize that you're going to have to essentially come back to that place again and again, is that you're on the upward swing, you live it, you love it, you keep doing it, and as you head back down, sooner rather than later, you learn to head back in and ask those questions again and make sure you get back in line with the soul of the organization. And that's what allows an organization to live over a long period of time. It's interesting to me to realize that this is something that for many other churches that I've served, which have been close to 150 years old, they've gone through a life cycle several times in the time that they've been in existence. In many ways, where we're at Maplewood this is the first life cycle of Maplewood, because the church is only about 57 years old, and up until the last 12 to 15 years, Maplewood has been growing and thriving, and it was only somewhere in there that it started this decline. And what does that have to do with us? It is this piece as we start to think and start to go into kind of the work of this book, is to realize what we're looking for is not a tagline that makes everybody happy. We're not looking for what is the best practice next door or it's somewhere else. We're looking for the things that will help Maplewood be Maplewood, and to live out the call that God has put on this church and filled with His Holy Spirit. And the truth of that authenticity is that is the place where we will see the most energy and the most ability to truly see God's Spirit working among us. So I invite you to read Chapter 3 and join us this Saturday morning at 9 o'clock for Chapter 3. There's also a discussion guide connected to the email that will help you kind of think through some of the other parts and more of what how might you see the soul of Maplewood? Thank you.